All right. This is chapter 12 notes, part one. We're going to start talking about the lymphatic system as well as the immune system, and the two of them go hand in hand. So, hide this. I don't know if you can see it on your screen. Okay. So, what's the purpose of the lymphatic system? So, the lymphatic system is a series of vessels that are kind of snug against our, veins and arteries that we learn about in chapter 11. And their job is to return lost fluid from the cardiovascular system back to the cardiovascular system. And not only do they return the lost fluid, but they clean it along the way. So, if somebody borrows something from you, not only do they give it back to you, but they're going to clean it and, make it look all nice. And that's exactly what the lymphatic system is doing. And so we have about 6 liters of blood that is whooshing through our body all day long. And I talk about how, the blood is a soccer mom vehicle, and there's all this stuff in blood that needs to get in and out at different stops and capillary beds. Well, it's not a perfect system. All right. Mom's come into a kind of a slow roll as she's going through the capillary beds. And so not everything can make its way back on to the soccer mom van or, blood. And so what happens is that fluid gets lost in those capillary beds. So there's the interstitial spaces in between cells. And so what the lymphatic system does is that actually catches, sucks up that lost fluid, and it's going to return it back to the immune system, or sorry, to the cardiovascular system. And the immune system is involved because our lymphatic vessels, as well as our lymph nodes that we're going to talk about, house immune cells or different types of white blood cells that are going to clean that lymph. So when it's returned to the cardiovascular system, it's hopefully, pathogen and debris free. If you do anatomy and physiology dissections, they usually inject dye into different organ systems. So like arteries are red and veins are blue, nerves yellow. The lymphatic vessels are often green. And so this is showing the widespread lymphatic vessels throughout our body. So when it comes to lymphatic vessels, we have two main types. The lymphatic system, excuse me, we've got two things. We've got lymphatic vessels, which are a combination of lymphatic capillaries, which are one cell layer thick, just like our cardiovascular capillaries. Lymphatic vessels are lymphatics that are very similar to veins. And then we have lymphatic ducts, which to me are kind of like vena cava, very large ducts that are going to all the lymphatics are going to dump uh, their lymph into two different ducts, which are then going to put that lymph back into the cardiovascular system. And then we've got lymph tissue, we've got lymph nodes, but then we also have lymphatic organs that are spread around our body. The lymphatic organs are very similar to the endocrine organs in our body, and that they're not a continuous system like the digestive system, but it's lymph tissue that's spread around our body. So in this picture, let's see here. You can probably see my cursor, but I'm gonna get a laser pointer. So here's a blood vessel, and then here you have a lymphatic vessel that's, butted up right against the blood vessel, and then here's a little tiny lymph node right here. They kind of look like little kidney beans. And then again, just another picture showing some lymphatic vessels, some lymph nodes. Our tonsils are considered lymphoid organs. Our spleen is lymphoid organs. The thymus is a lymphoid organ. Bone marrow, I guess it's kind of considered a lymphoid organ because it produces our white blood cells, but we'll get more into that later. So lymphatics is a collective term for lymphatic vessels. So they're a one-way vessel that is going to return that lost fluid that gets left behind in the capillary spaces to the cardiovascular system. So again, about half of our blood volume. So if we have 6 liters of blood, about half of our blood volume gets left behind in those interstitial spaces every single day. If that didn't get returned, we go into shock and we die pretty quickly. So those 3 liters have to be returned to the cardiovascular system. And so we have lymph capillaries that are there, one cell layer thick, and they're going to be absorbing that lost fluid. They're made out of endothelial cells that are very loosely attached to each other. And because they're so loosely attached to each other, they almost make little openings, little holes, okay? And then if this is the inside of a lymphatic capillary, what happens is that as they're empty, the cells kind of go down like this. And then when lymph fills into the capillaries, it closes shut, creating like a valve, a no going backsies type thing. Then lymph is going to be pushed into the lymphatic collecting vessels or lymphatics. And then again, as I mentioned before, we have two different main lymphatic ducts that lymph is drained to. Um, there is no heart. All right. So we've got a heart that's pushing blood through the arteries and capillaries and veins, but there is no heart associated with the lymphatic vessels. So we rely on the moving of our body and the squeezing actions from our skeletal muscles, or milking action, as they call it, to push that lymph back to the cardiovascular system. So when people are sedentary, not moving, it's not great for circulation. It's not great for returning that lost fluid back to the cardiovascular system. So here we have an arteriole from the cardiovascular system going into a capillary bed and then a venule. And then as you can see, you've got lymphatic capillaries that are all these little kind of tan things are all our tissue cells. The lymphatic capillaries are going to be interwoven in with our cardiovascular capillaries to pick up that lost fluid. Again, lymphatic vessels they have very large openings because the cells are very loosely attached to each other, and they are going to receive that lymph. When you have an injury, say you get hit in the arm, okay, what's going to happen is that those lymphatic capillaries are actually going to become leaky. They're not going to suck up that fluid. And then what happens? You get swelling, okay? You have white blood cells that are hanging out in your lymphatic vessels. And so white blood cells, lymph, blood vessels are going to become a little leaky, which is going to be creating a bruise, and stuff like that. So that's what happens when you have that edema or that swelling, is because those lymphatic capillaries now become leaky. And again, if too much lymph accumulates, just as I just said, you're going to develop edema, okay? So why is swelling or edema bad? Well, the cells get their stuff from interstitial fluid, right? Interstitial fluid is like the medium between blood and tissue cells, and stuff diffuses out from blood into the interstitial space or interstitial fluid and goes into the cells, and vice versa. And if it becomes too dilute because too much lymph is there, it's going to be really hard for cells to come into contact with nutrients and oxygen. Again, just showing you capillary bed and lymphatic capillaries spread in between. So what is lymph? Okay, once this lost fluid from the cardiovascular system is picked up by the lymphatic capillaries, we're going to call it lymph. And it's mostly plasma. It's going to be some cellular debris, maybe some pathogens. Okay, on its way back to the cardiovascular system, it is going to get passed through a series of lymph nodes. And then in those lymph nodes, they're kind of like border stops, if you will, checkpoints. The lymph is going to have an opportunity to come into contact with our immune cells and thus be clean. And again, as I mentioned before, there is no heart in the lymphatic vessel system creating pressure to get that lymph back to the cardiovascular system like the heart does for the cardiovascular system. So we rely on the movement of our body and the squeeze in action from our skeletal muscles. To help move that lymph back to the cardiovascular system. Lymphatic vessels are very similar to veins in the fact that they are very low pressure, and they also have valves to prevent backflow of lymph. All right, looking at a lymph node. So we have, anywhere from 600 or 1,000 lymph nodes in the body. We do have them all over our body, but we have an aggregate of them in our cervical region, our neck, and our axillary region, or our armpit and our inguinal region, or, where your thigh is coming up to meet your trunk on the medial side. Lymph nodes, they kind of look like a kidney bean. They have a similar shape, but they're tiny. They're about an inch. Yeah. So they are, about an inch all around here. So not super big. And they're going to house macrophages, which are a type of white blood cell that does phagocytosis, and lymphocytes. And lymphocytes, as we've talked about, come in two different varieties. They can either be B lymphocytes or T lymphocytes. And they are involved in what's called our adaptive immune system, which we're going to talk about later. So this is showing some of our lymphatic vessels as well as lymph nodes. As I mentioned, your tonsils are a lymphoid organ. Your thymus is a lymphoid organ. Spleen is a lymphoid organ. Peyer's patches and appendix are also lymphoid organs. And bone marrow is where our white blood cells are produced. Here is a lymph node. As I said, it kind of looks like a kidney, okay? So here's the lymph node. So here's a cross section of it right here. We're going to call the outer connective tissue sheath that covers the outside of the lymph node the capsule. And then parts of the capsule actually come in like this and separate the outer portion or the cortex, okay? And we call the pieces of the capsule that come in and separate the cortex trabeculae. This outer region where you see this kind of purple pink out here is called the cortex. And this inner area where you just see the purplish blue is going to be the medulla. So we've heard of cortex and medulla before. Cortex means outer portion, medulla means inner portion. There are vessels, as we can see over here, and they're pointing with the arrow, that are bringing lymph towards the lymph node. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 vessels. They're called afferent or afferent vessels that are bringing lymph towards the lymph node. But we only have one vessel bringing lymph away, one efferent lymphoid vessel here. So it's kind of like you've got 6 roads coming into the lymph node and only one Route 9 here leaving. And so what does that do? That makes lymph sit inside the lymph node for a long time so that it can pass through all of these spaces and come into contact with immune cells. So out here in the cortex, we have T lymphocytes. So this is showing kind of a blow up here of what's called the germinal center. Okay, so in the cortex, we've got T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes. In the medulla, all right, we're going to have macrophages, okay? So T lymphocytes and B lymphocytes live out here in the cortex, in these germinal centers, and then in the medulla, macrophages. And so we've got multiple afferent vessels coming in, bringing that lymph, and now the lymph only has one way to get out. So it's going to move very slowly through the lymph node and have an opportunity to come into contact with T cells, B cells, and macrophages to clean that lymph and get rid of any, potential creepy crawlers that are hanging out in our body. So this would be the cortex. So here's the capsule on the outside. There's pieces of the capsule coming in called the trabeculae. This would be cortex. This would be medulla. You can see it very different. These are the germinal centers, these little circles. They are housing B cells and T cells. They're going to be either naive B cells and T cells, which means that they have not come into contact with their antigenic enemy, or they're going to be memory cells that have been stored in our body so that we can quickly identify a bad guy. And then macrophages are located here, and they are doing phagocytosis, eating cellular debris, pathogens, what have you. So our other lymph organs, we've got the thymus. So we learned about the thymus back in chapter 9. So that's in our chest. The thymus is the site of T cell boot camp. So that is where our T lymphocytes, which are I call them the immune snipers, they're doing direct cell-to-cell combat. They get trained in the thymus. And as we learned, the thymus is going to start to atrophy as we age, which is why, as we get older, we become more susceptible to different things. Your tonsils. You actually have 3 sets of tonsils. Okay, you have a set of tonsils in your nasal cavity at the posterior aspect. You might have heard of the adenoids. Those are your nasopharyngeal tonsils. You have some in your throat. If you go to the mirror in the bathroom and stick out your tongue and maybe put your finger on your tongue so you can see, you'll see a set of tonsils on either side of your mouth. Those are your palatine tonsils. And then at the base of your tongue, you have a third set, which are your lingual tonsils. They have an aggregate of white blood cells there. If we think about it, we have stuff coming into our body through our nose, through our mouth. So we have those 3 sets of tonsils there to be able to house some immune cells or police officers or border patrol agents, what have you, that are going to catch any nasty guys that are trying to make their way in. Peyer's patches are similar to tonsils, but they are found in the small intestine. We talked about the alimentary canal or the food tube. Everything that's in the alimentary canal is considered outside of the body until it crosses to our bloodstream. And where does that happen? In the small intestine. And so it makes sense that we have Peyer's patches, which again are like Border Patrol agents that are waiting and watching for things that are trying to get absorbed into our bloodstream. So they also house immune cells. The spleen is responsible for recycling dead, dying red blood cells. And the only thing that is missing here, which I will write in, is the appendix. So the appendix is a finger-like appendage that is hanging off our large intestine. In humans right now, it's considered a vestigial structure, meaning that it really has no major function. It does house immune cells, so it could be involved in immunity. But really, for us, oftentimes it can get impacted with feces and become inflamed, appendicitis, potentially burst. Interestingly enough, horses have a really big appendix. And if we think about like what horses eat, they eat grass and hay, and they have to, in their large intestine, break that cellulose material down that's in hay and grass, like things that we can't digest right now. So like we can't digest cellulose; it's just fiber in our diet. So perhaps at some point the appendix maybe was involved in our digestive system when we had more of a grass-based diet. That's my thought. And again, just showing you the lymph organs and where they're located. So when it comes to our immune system, we have two different branches of our immune system, okay? We have innate body defenses, and I call the innate defense system our Lady Gaga branch. We are all born with these things. It's standard among humans. The specific defense system, which is also called the adaptive, is going to be germ or antigen specific, and it is based on what we are exposed to in our lifetime. And so probably no two people's specific or adaptive immune system are going to be exactly the same. We need both of these systems to work together in order to, have our military protecting our body. The innate systems are quick. They're non-specific. They'll try to fight everybody. And again, the specific or adaptive immune system is germ specific. Sometimes it can take longer for it to be activated. So in the immune system, again, we've got the innate or non-specific branch, and we have the adaptive or the specific branch. The innate is considered the first line of defenses, and I think about like fighting in the Revolutionary War or the Civil War. You had all the soldiers line up, so you had your first line, second line, third line, what have you. The first line of defense is literally the first line right out there, trying to prevent things from coming across. They can be physical barriers, they can have cellular components that are non-specific, and also stuff which are called humoral components, which are things in our blood. The adaptive line is our second line of defense. It is antigen specific. It's going to take a little longer for the body to calculate a plan with the adaptive immune system. There are cellular components, and by that I mean T lymphocytes and macrophages, and then humoral components, which by that I mean antibodies, and we're going to learn more about that. The innate or non-specific, our first line of defense, comprises of 6 different things, okay, which we're going to be talking about. First is our surface membrane barriers, our skin, intact mucosa, like we have something that's protecting us from the outside. We then have 2 non-specific types of cells that do phagocytosis, which are macrophages and neutrophils. Macrophages were monocytes. Natural killer cells are actually a type of T lymphocyte that's non-specific. We have the ability to have an inflammatory response, which is redness, heat, swelling, and pain. We have the ability to have a fever, all right, which cranks up our metabolism. And then we have antimicrobial proteins, which are called complement, which function similar to antibodies, but these are non-specific. And you put this in your notes, and we're going to talk about this in much more detail. And so here we've got an infectious agent, all right, which most often that antigenic structure is a protein, and it's going to activate the innate immune system, which will then turn on the adaptive immune system. In my mind, I think like the innate immune system is just trying to like bob and weave and potentially, keep this bad guy at bay. And it also alerts the rest of the body and it will activate the adaptive immune system to get the special killers in there that are specifically meant to take down this antigen. The adaptive immune system is antigen specific. Okay, so these are cells that are specifically meant to fight a specific invader. And what's good about it is that it is systemic, meaning that it's a reaction that happens all over our body. And it also creates what's called immunological memory. This is why we get vaccinations. We put a piece of that virus or what have you in our body fights it off, and then it creates memory cells so that if you are exposed to that antigen again, you can very quickly defeat it. And this is just showing our innate immune system and our adaptive immune system, what's involved in each of them and kind of where they overlap. And they are doing some construction next door, and I'm going to stop there.